Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. I was absolutely over the moon when today's guest, the wonderful Ayobami Adébáyọ, said yes to coming on the show. I have absolutely loved her work, finding great inspiration, thoughtfulness, and deep understanding of what it really means to be human in her words. I devoured her debut novel, Stay With Me, which was published back in 2017, and recently read her new novel, A Spell of Good Things, and only have good things to say about it. Ayobami Adébáyọ was born in Lagos, Nigeria. Her debut novel, Stay With Me, won the 9 Nobel Prize for Literature, was shortlisted for the Bailey's Prize for Women's Fiction, the Wellcome Book Prize, and the Kwani Manuscript Prize. It has been translated into 20 languages, and the French translation was awarded the Prix Les Afriques, long-listed for the International Dylan Thomas Prize and the International Dublin Literary Award. Stay With Me was a New York Times, Guardian, Chicago Tribune, and NPR Best Book of the Year. Her latest novel, A Spell of Good Things, is to be published in February 2023 by Canongate Books. Just a disclaimer before we start today's episode. Ayobami and I talk about some really heavy topics in this conversation, including infertility and the loss of a child. If you feel like it might be quite difficult for you to listen to these topics being discussed, please come back to this episode at a time that feels better for you. Hi, Ayobami. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. How are you doing?
Very well, Samia. Thank you for having me.
I'm so thrilled that we're doing this. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I'm a huge, huge fan of your work. And you, of course, you, of course, have written 2 novels, one that was published in 2017 and one that will be gracing the bookshelves of bookshops in the UK from February 2023. And that's called A Spell of Good Things. So if you can just tell us a little bit about your 2 books, Stay With Me and A Spell of Good Things.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Samia, for having me. It's really lovely to chat to you. Stay With Me is it's a novel about a marriage and how it sort of implodes from within. And it's about 2 people who do care for each other, but are limited in all kinds of ways by the baggage that they each bring, into the marriage. And it's told in alternating chapters from both perspectives. So that's sort of what Stay With Me is about. There's a lot going on, but that's what's at the heart of it. One way I like to describe it is that it's really a conversation between 2 people, because the way the novel is written and structured, the marriage is sort of, they've gone their separate ways and now they're going to run into each other again, and they're sort of talking to each other. That's how it begins, and they're looking over, and each person is building an argument, throughout the book. So that's what that one was about. A Spell of Good Things is about 2 families. It's also about a city, the city that they both live in, but it's about 2 families at opposite ends of the class spectrum. There's a family that is well to do, and there's a family that is barely getting by. And it's really about how all their lives intersect, how they, even though they are on different ends of the spectrum, because they're in the same society and community, they have a somewhat collective destiny. So this one is told from 9 perspectives. So we sort of toggle through different members of the family, but we have 2 anchor characters, one in each family, whose story is at the center of the novel. I hope I did both books a bit of justice.
Oh, you definitely
Um,
did. You definitely, and I appreciate kind of not trying to give away too much about either book. So
mm,
so that's great. We try and avoid major spoilers. Obviously, we have to talk a little bit about what happens. But yeah, brilliant. And
mhm,
I have read both books and absolutely loved both of them for different reasons, and the characters were so different. But you talk about a lot of really important themes and issues in both books, and some of them are
mm,
similar. And I think one real issue that you tackle is women's existence in society. And we
mm,
see in both
mm,
Stay With Me and in A Spell of Good Things that there seems to be this idea that a woman's existence is only valid or validated when she gets
mm,
married, and in the case of Stay With Me,
mm,
especially when she has children.
mm,
And obviously,
mhm,
we see that a lot in A Spell of Good Things because you touch on violence against women in kind of two different generations. And then, obviously, in Stay With Me, we see the issue of infertility and the impact that it has on the couple. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about that. Why for you has that been a central theme? What's your own experiences of it, and what did you really want to bring out about that topic?
yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that one of the ways I think about writing, is that it's for me a way to think through things, you know, that I tend to return to subjects that I find perplexing
Mm,
sometimes. That sometimes I'm like, I just don't get why this is this way, and
mm,
I try to write through that and, just try to see it from different perspectives. And sometimes by the time I'm done, I understand things a little better. I have a little more empathy. I think sometimes a more structural overview of things.
mm,
So I think right from the time I was a teenager, I've been very acutely aware of the way that women are allowed or disallowed from existing in society,
mm,
existing within families, existing within communities. And if I'm to think about it in a personal sense, I feel like part of it is because I do think that I had a somewhat different upbringing than many of the people that I grew up with. So in my family, I didn't really encounter a lot of the things that I would encounter when I went outside into the world. And I think that I had a really drastic culture shock as a result. So, I mean, I'll tell a story and I'll give you an anecdote that sort of illustrates this. When I was in secondary school, my last year of secondary school in Nigeria, I was the head girl in the school and also the class monitress. So these are like positions that you're given by the school authority. They pick someone as the head boy and the head
mm,
girl. And it was a private school, so we had cleaners who would clean the classes every time. But by the time we were in the third year, the school decided that once you're in the final year, you have to take responsibility for cleaning the classes. So it sort of fell upon me to draw a timetable for how to clean the classes. And it was going to be every day from Monday to Friday, and I would put down names. So of course, I drew a timetable that had everybody in the class on it. And to be honest with you, I didn't think I was making any kind of statement.
mm.
It just seemed sensible. And it's something I haven't forgotten, just the uproar from many of the boys in my class,
Wow, yeah.
and how they said to me, why was I insulting them by saying they should sweep the class? And
Mm,
I was just genuinely confused. And I
mm,
think that, I talked to one of them about almost a decade after this, and he said, I remember, I never forget what you did to us. And I think that's when I really started thinking about it. At that point, when I think I was 15, I was just upset. Like, are you all stupid? You mean you're going to litter the class and I'm supposed to just clean after you? Why? You know. the principal had to get involved. It was quite a bit of drama. It lasted about 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
And yeah.
He
Um,
must have felt so confused because to you it seems like such a small thing, like just
it was so
tidy up after
confusing.
yourself, and
Yeah.
it's blown so massively out of proportion.
Yeah. So, and I think that was sort of my first moment of realizing that
Mm.
things did not necessarily operate in the world outside the way they operated in my family, which sort of operated more as a gerontocracy. So I think that was my first sort of rude awakening, a
Yeah.
realization that things did not necessarily operate the way that I assumed they would,
Mm.
in the world. So I think that since then I've been very interested and observant about the way women are expected to exist in the world and the
Mm.
ways they are often expected to compromise their humanity,
Mm.
in service of some cultural ideal or perception.
Have you felt a change in these ideas in practice in Nigeria over the years?
Mm. I mean, it's honestly difficult to tell.
Mm.
I mean, I think that's where I am in relation to it now. That I feel like sometimes you think, oh yeah, things have changed, and then you're like, I'm not sure.
Mm.
So, but what I do think as one of the things I think has changed, I think, is that more and more younger women are quite vocal, you know,
Mm.
about what they think of these things. Sometimes it's difficult for me to tell if
Mm.
things have actually changed, if they've gotten better, if they've gotten worse, if the same old things are manifesting themselves in new dimensions. Because sometimes I feel like, oh yes, we're getting past some of these ideas and ways of thinking, and then something happens, and I'm like, well, maybe not.
Mm.
But one of the significant things that I think have changed is that I feel like that more and more, many women, in many cases, younger women are becoming very vocal about the impact that some of these ideas have on their lives.
Mm.
And I've been very happy to see that.
Mm. And I think it's important to remember as well, like these issues when it comes to like how kind of valid women are and what their or like where the sources of their validation seems to lie isn't just an issue in Nigeria, it's an issue in communities all over the world. And I'd say even in like in west quote unquote western countries like the UK and like America, there is still so much like so many things are unequal. There's still a huge issue with regards to like unpaid domestic labor and an
Mm-hmm.
expectation that women are still going to look after the house, but she's also going to work and she's going to raise kids and she's going to do this. And it seems to be a global phenomena, right? Like it's not just Nigeria. And I think the same goes for even in the UK. Like we see many things changing, but
Mm-hmm.
we also see many things that are not changing, and we see things that are staying the same and getting worse. And
Mm-hmm.
I think there are more spaces for people to be open and to share their experiences, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
definitely helping and bringing some change in discourse. But I guess we're dealing with thousands of years of the patriarchy and around the world, and trying to come out of that is difficult. It's really difficult, and I guess we live in hope that we do what we can to facilitate
Mm-hmm.
change and that it will continue to improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just agreeing with you. I think that, yeah, I think it's tricky, in many ways.
Mm.
I can't remember who it was now. I mean, there's this book of African literature that I have, and there's this Zimbabwean, I think it's Zimbabwean, writer who was writing about feminism. And she made a point that, it was easier to fight the colonial power than to fight your brother, you know. Um, or your uncle. And the point she was making was that it's a more it can be a more tricky struggle in many ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think obviously in Stay With Me and A Spell of Good Things, the focus is on how much marriage is central to society and community, but also in how much women feel accepted and validated in their lives and within their families and within their communities, which I think is a huge issue. And obviously we see that in A Spell of Good Things as well. And I think your books have made me feel, or made me sort of reflect on the fact that we should all be able to choose how we live our lives and what we do in terms of living, like getting married or not getting married or whatever, or having children or not having children, because that's what makes us happy, and not because this is what society deems appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there'll be instances where there's an overlap, between expectation and what the individual desires. But even in those instances, if those expectations are not managed in a way that is humane,
Mm.
in a way that considers, primarily the health of this person, the happiness of this person, it can be very dangerous. And I think that one of the things that I'm often interested in my writing is when it's in those intimate spaces and some of the forms of violence, that is possible, often in the name of love, and wanting the best for a person.
Yeah, and you explore that quite openly in A Spell of Good Things. There is a case of violence against women, and it's in a romantic relationship at the hands of a man. And what I really appreciated about it was that it showed how complex the situation is. Like, we had an understanding of kind of where where the aggression was coming from in terms of the society within which this couple were living in, but also how many different thoughts the woman had with regards to whether or not she was going to leave him, and how difficult it can be in a society where marriage is so important.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
so what are your kind of like views and any experiences that you have or you've seen or you've read about with regards to that?
I mean, I think the closest I've come to that, I've had two friends, say in the last 7 years or so, were in relationships where their partner was physically violent to them. And one of the things that I wanted to think through, that is closest to me was, I mean, with one of them I was aware, and with the other person I didn't even know until the relationship was over. And I wanted to think through, just also my own blindness to that. That this is someone that I cared for, and I just didn't see it at all, until it was over and she was talking about it in retrospect. And just talking with her and thinking of some of the considerations that kept her in the relationship for longer than she should have stayed. I think that really helped me in thinking about this book, that I wanted to go into her perspective and experience the relationship from her perspective, experience the options that she feels are available to her from her perspective, and even the shock of it, and the rationalizations, that she makes. I wanted to have that inside out view of things, So that was it for me. And in relation to her and the members of her family and the people that surround her, It's only maybe about two people that really pick up on it. Even though it's sort of right there in their faces. There's our sister, there's, you know, an ex-boyfriend who sort of has a sense that something is not quite right in this new relationship. I also wanted to see how, everyone around that is so excited and they can't notice that something is off,
Yeah, definitely. And I think what I appreciated about it the most was that it was a nuanced, such a nuanced representation of those complexities, because it wasn't just her convincing herself and then reconvincing herself that he loves her. We could see how multi-layered and how difficult. The Ricky Kendall talks about feminism and how if we don't make basic essential things that we need in life, like accommodation and access to food and those things, if we don't make those available to women, and especially Black women, we're making it harder for people to walk away from harmful relationships. Even though the character in the book has her own job, so she has a source of income, but we see how kind of caught up it is in politics and still expectation of her parents, and she still doesn't have that ability to fully be independent.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that for me, many times every time I'm writing fiction, sometimes it begins with an idea, but really for me, it's always about the character, the character. So I'm very interested in the character, not primarily as a vehicle, for ideas or topics, but they're a person that I'm trying to get to understand and to get to know. And once I do that, I'm also trying to figure out how do I communicate their inner lives in a language that is faithful to them. In the metaphors of their daily life. And I hope that that's where I think that that's where the complexity and the layers, arise, with many of the characters. That very few lives, I think, are simple.
Yes, definitely. I definitely agree with you on that. With Stay With Me, you're telling a story essentially of this couple, and they're living in this period of huge political upheaval in Nigeria in the 80s. But at the same time, we see this sort of like huge, almost upheaval in their own lives, right? Like these huge kind of issues that they're facing with trying to have their own family and get pregnant. And then there's like all this kind of like drama and a something, like a plot twist thrown in, and it's intense, like it's a lot. But it's also happening within this period of complete chaos almost in the country. Why did you decide to have two things that were so chaotic happening at the same time?
I mean, I think that with that book, there was a useful parallel, in the story of the country at that point. And when the novel opens, a new military dictator has just come into power. And what often happened, in the 1980s was this, to use this language, this honeymoon period, where even though it's a military dictatorship, people sometimes go into the street, and rejoice and feel that, oh, things are going to get better somehow, with this. And then slowly things, of course, begin to unravel, and then there's the disillusionment. And then everything bubbles up in some kind of unrest, towards the end of the novel. So that, for me, I thought it was a useful parallel, and a sort of that both could be metaphors for each other in many ways. And with that book, it was more in the background. at the end of the day.
Mm.
Initially, in earlier drafts, the politics was more at the fore of the novel.
Mm.
And then I just realized that it wasn't really working
Mm.
organically with the story that I was telling. And
Mm.
so the thing was to just move it into the background and just get the sense, primarily through the lives that this couple is leading, of how just fragile things are on the national level and how quickly things, are heading downhill
Mm.
in the country. And the other thing is just also that it was just a period in Nigerian history that I was very interested in
Mm.
and sort of geeked out on and studied a lot about. And a period that I think that is is useful even in understanding contemporary Nigeria. That a lot of things that would shape our identity, our current identity, some of it positive, some of it negative,
Mm.
was that period was a point at which many of them were established,
Mm.
in our national psyche.
I do like the fact that both of your novels have placed an emphasis on kind of what is happening within the country or the locality
Mm,
beyond the lives of the characters that we meet. And I think it is always such a nice reminder that no matter what is happening in your life, there's also like a bigger picture and there's other things
mm,
going on. And it helps us to remain, I feel like, connected to other
mm,
people and to
mm,
history. And actually, in A Spell of Good Things, you explore really quite, it's quite somber actually, the
mm,
exploration of poverty,
mm,
of the family, or one of the families
mm,
anyway, and it's juxtaposed in many ways to,
mm,
to the other family
mm,
that you write about, and obviously they
mm,
intertwine in many ways for that reason, that
mm,
one is in a less fortunate position and they're
mm,
seeking help or support from the other in some ways,
mm,
and it's also tied into this background of real politics. So where
mm.
did the inspiration of that for that come from?
I wish I knew so that I could be sure that I would get it again. So it began with, with first of all, Eniola from the young boy,
Mm.
and then as I kept working on it, it sort of kept expanding. Then the second family came in,
Mm.
and with this book, right from the beginning, I was very interested in the particular politics of the states that it's set in Nigeria. So it's set in a city that, I don't give it a name, but I know particularly what city it is and what state it is.
Mm.
And it's the 2000s, you could pick any year in the early to mid 2000s in Nigeria.
Mm.
And there'd been a particular policy, in which several teachers were fired
Mm.
sort of overnight. And it's now about 23 years since then.
Mm.
And I think it's almost mostly forgotten.
Mm.
I'm not sure how many people, I mean, Nigeria is a huge country. It's a very small state. It's one of the smallest states. But I'm really very interested in the impact of those things on people's lives.
Mm.
And with this book, that was one of the things that I wanted to think through and write about,
Mm.
with this young boy in particular. His father is one of the teachers who's been fired. And I wanted to look at how has this impacted this family in ways they might never have expected,
Mm.
when it happened. And in ways that, I mean, to me, it seems like the country has forgotten about.
Mm.
And there are thousands of people, thousands of children who grew up in that environment of seeing their parents go through that kind of job loss.
Mm.
And not just a job loss, but it's almost like the value of the work that they were doing was being spat upon,
Mm.
by the government in that community.
Mm.
Um, so that with this particular book, I think that the politics was um, was central enough to be a character right from the beginning. It's all it's in everything. It's in their lives. It's in the lives of the other family, and I think that. I think politics matters,
Of course, yeah.
in many ways, and
Mm,
can have such far-reaching impact on the lives of many people.
mm,
And I'm interested in writing that, in teasing that out in fiction, particularly, in this instance, a throwaway policy that nobody remembers maybe 25 years later, but which has had such an impact, in my
mm.
opinion, on the way that the society is then evolved after that. So I hope that answered your question.
I definitely, and I actually I loved listening to everything that you just said, because I mean, you're definitely right. Politics is so important because it
Mm,
affects our everyday lives, right? Like,
mm,
it affects how much food costs and fuel
mm,
costs, and
mhm,
how that impacts how we can live our lives, and how nourished we are, and how healthy we are, and do we have access to healthcare, like, do we have access to education? And that was a
mhm,
huge theme in the book as well.
mm,
And I really I love the way that you tease that out through the novel, showing exactly how it is impacting this family in so many different ways. And there's this really kind of sweet but very sad moment as well, where Aniolo is just been told that he's able to do an apprenticeship to learn to become a tailor, essentially.
mhm,
And he's thinking about his future, and he says, I'm never going to be a teacher.
mm,
And it, to me, I was like, whoa, because what would have been previously a considered for him a great career, somebody that he and teachers he looks up to and can see that they're
mm,
helping mold his life, but because of everything that's going on, it's
mm,
completely changed the way he views them, right? And
mhm,
the reality of living with his father. And I just thought it was
mm,
so profound,
mm,
really small, like a very small section, but like it was
mm,
so profound. And I felt like, wow, this boy who we already see is making sacrifice after sacrifice
mm,
for his
mm,
family and trying so hard, and he cares so much for his sister as well.
mm,
um but it just, yeah, like it really kind of brought home how difficult everything was for him.
mm,
In A Spell
mhm,
of Good Things, we have like children characters that we don't really have. We
mm,
don't have in Stay With Me. Although both of them, both books, center a lot on children and on
mm,
family. And what I felt with Stay With Me was that the ending, although the book was really sad, like some very, very
mm,
tragic things that were very difficult to read, I think, and
mm,
um, especially as a woman, especially as someone that doesn't yet have children but really hopes to
mhm,
one day, like,
mhm,
some of those things really, really, that I found them very difficult to read. And I remember at one point like having to close the book and just kind of breathe because it felt so sad.
mm,
But the ending was still very hopeful. And what I had with A Spell of Good Things, I left that I'd closed that book and I was just like, oh my goodness, what happens next? Like, what? And it felt, and the ending of A Spell of Good Things felt more heavy and
mm,
more uncertain. Why did you
mm.
decide to leave it on such an almost a cliffhanger, but also
Oh,
for it not to be as hopeful as the way that you ended Stay With Me?
mm. I mean that was a difficult choice,
Mm.
with Stay With Me. I remember, I mean, I can imagine, I often sometimes I want to apologize to people and say I'm sorry, this book is so hard, But I mean, it was also a very difficult book to write. That
Mm.
feeling you just described. Um, I remember, moments when I would be working on it and then I would just go out and take a walk for about an hour because I couldn't, it was so hard. There were reasons for that book, for instance, particularly with the situation with sickle cell anemia. that I felt I needed to stay faithful to. So I couldn't pull back, on it in any way, with a spell of good things. Again, it was difficult to handle it that way. And I think that one of the reasons it took me a while to finish it was that I was trying to avoid that ending. Because for me, one of the things I said to myself when I finished it with me is that I'm not writing a sad book again. I'm going to write like 2 more books before I do another book that is sad. And I said that to myself many times. Like, no, I'm not doing this again. But by the time I was like, it's got like 24 chapters. But at the point I was like around chapter 20, and I was probably circling that ending for almost a year. And at some point, I had to accept that this was what this book was building up to. And not just that was what the book was building up to, but also that in some ways that's the kind of ending that, or the kind of culmination, of persistent and unaddressed injustice, in a community. That is often the culmination of it. And sometimes the tragedies are not always as visible, but I do think that ending says something, about the consequences of some of the decisions, that have been made during the book, and also the fact that one half of the society cannot really insulate themselves as much as they imagine they can.
That's really interesting, that last point that you made. And I think as well, I think about the sadness and not wanting to write a sad book. Like, you've written a book about family and community caught up in a very difficult political time. If there wasn't sadness in that, it would be not realistic, right? Because it's so difficult. But also, like, there is sadness, I think, in everybody's lives lots of the time, not all of the time, but there's like sad things that happen and sad things that make us sad, and all of that. And if we don't engage with that when we're telling stories and when you're writing, it feels detached, and not like sincere, or not really reflective of what's going on. But yeah, I also just, this last point that you made about how, like, the upper class, how they can sometimes feel protected against some of the more horrible things because they're almost like in a bubble surrounded by wealth and comfort, and they feel like that they're above the law in many ways and many places around the world. We see that play out in so many different ways, but the reality is that actually they're not always, right? And when something bad is going to happen, it's going to happen. But also because, like, politics and issues with communities and power and status, because those things are so messy, it doesn't exclude anybody, really. So yeah, really profound. And obviously you do, in Stay With Me, you write about the loss of a child, or of children with sickle cell anemia, and obviously there isn't that same storyline in A Spell of Good Things, but there is a child that goes away at the end of the book. So there's still a little bit of a recurrence, and obviously that's a very difficult thing to read about and to write about. And I understand that part of that is that you have experience of people around you in your personal life that have suffered from or are dealing with sickle cell anemia, and you've lost people as well. I'm very sorry for that. But why did you decide to tell a story based on parents that lose their children?
I mean, with Stay With Me, it was, like I said, when I was working on it's just, it was hard not to be faithful to it. because like you said, I've known people who suffered from the disease. I've known families who've lost, children from the disease. And I wanted to um, capture that struggle and the complexity, of that in fiction, and particularly from a mother's perspective, really to think about the possibility of that getting to a breaking point. And I mean, my hope, with that book was that the reader would be kinder to her than she is to herself, because I think that I think that we often have such sometimes impossible expectations of mothers, and in that particular circumstance, she couldn't bear up, after all of the losses at a certain point. She couldn't bear to consider the possibility that it would happen to her again. And so I think it's a long-winded way to say that I don't think that it's something that I decided unconsciously, in the sense that I didn't begin stay with me thinking I want to write about about this in particular. But to be honest, it was inspired by. I mean, the mother's character was inspired by the mother of one of my friends who had passed away. And I'd run into her, I think about a couple of years after, and I was just, this was someone I'd known almost all my life, and I was just struck by how different she was, and again, as I said at the beginning, I sometimes turn to fiction to go inside the things that I don't understand yet, and so that character kept coming back to me, and I began to write, I don't even think I was really thinking about what happened to my friend at the end, but I wanted to write what it was like, for her to receive the diagnosis, to know the implications, and to nurse this child and be with this child, all these years. So when I'm writing, things tend to just also evolve. And it's almost like I see the character going in a particular direction, and I just sort of follow them and try to understand why, why are these the choices they're making, and then the novel continues to expand and expand from that point.
It's such a devastating thing. I mean, I don't have any direct experience, but I know for certain that it's a devastating thing to experience. And we see maybe like increasingly it being talked about in the documentary space or the social media space, but not very much in fiction, because fiction, I mean, there's some very sad books, but still generally tends to, I feel, still avoid some of the very difficult things that happen in life, and especially those that happen to women, because a lot of, like the majority of authors are still in the world are still men, as it is the case in every field, really. And so I hope that people found some kind of relatability or healing, or I don't know, just some sort of comfort in seeing that represented and presented so beautifully throughout your book. And I mean, speaking from personal experience, like You Obviously Stay With Me also talks about the impact of infertility on a marriage, and that's something that I have personal experience of, and so I felt very much supported somewhat by the book and by these characters who, I mean, obviously are not real, they're fiction characters, but it some of the, like, I remember reading this quote where Yejide, she talks about how although the love for her husband hasn't dwindled and she still loves him so fiercely and so passionately, but there is this inevitable toll that seems to be taking on their lives, and there's other musings that she sort of makes about how she feels as a person, that she's failing or failing as a woman. And obviously then there's all these conversations that pop up about polygamy, whereas they had agreed that they would not do that ever before they got married. And I appreciated so much seeing that in fiction. In obviously I'm not Nigerian, but still in a community that I also found some similarities with as well. And just to feel, I think when you see something like that, you feel as though, yeah, like what I'm going through and what I'm feeling is totally fine. And that I too, as Yejide did, will figure it out. Like, you know, that there's always hope. And I think for me personally, that's also why I appreciated the fact that Stay With Me ended on a hopeful note.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much. Sometimes I can't remember who it was recently and who had asked me to sign a copy for their friend who was struggling with infertility. And I remember thinking to myself, and I might have said it to them, like, are you sure you want to give them this book? I don't know, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. It was one of the things that I did hope for. That I hope that it, with that book in particular, that I hope that it bore witness to the lives and the experiences, of many women across the world, and that they could feel seen in some fundamental way.
Yeah, because I think like struggles with infertility can feel so isolating, because you feel like everybody around you isn't having an issue, and there's babies everywhere and all kinds of stuff. And so it does definitely feel nice to see it presented in literature. But I would say, I mean, especially for anybody listening, like if this is something that you're dealing with, like you need to be aware that this is what the book also deals with, and make a judgment for yourself about whether or not at that moment in time you're ready to read it, basically, because everybody's experiences and level of fragility is different at different times. So I just wanted to add that disclaimer. I don't want anyone being very upset and blaming me for that. But as well as obviously, like we've talked about children and the loss of children and not having them, but family generally is a huge theme in both of your books. And I loved reading. I love reading about families in general, and we see in Stay With Me, like Judy doesn't really have a family of her own, and she seems to be, this is what she really wants. She's chasing it, and in a spell of good things, we meet two families, and we see like how complex and messy, and all the secrets and all the things that are just not being talked about. So what's really driven you to write about family?
I'm very interested in them. I think there's such fascinating spaces to study people. And my particular family is relatively small compared to, say, many families in Nigeria. But my mom, for instance, comes from a very big family. So I grew up with quite a number of aunties and uncles, and I think they might have been my first character studies, that as a child I was very curious about how the human mind works. That was the space in which I could observe people interact with each other and love each other and be frustrated by each other and resolve all kinds of contradictions, within this frame. So that it's something that I think that I will continue to be interested in and curious about, the ways they form, the ways they hold each other together, the ways they fall apart. For instance, with this kind of group things, one of the things I was interested in also was how within this very, very intimate setup, people can sometimes be invisible to each other, but you see that they don't all see each other, fully at every point in time. And that was something that I wanted to also write about.
Yeah, definitely, because your exploration of family kind of it goes really deep and in some ways like really granular, giving us a very intimate view of families and of dynamics and people and love and all kinds of love. Like you write a lot about love, and I love love. Um, but you do like
Yeah.
obviously like Stay With Me has a very strong the marriage is like very strong, like we're introduced to the couple at the beginning, and you can tell like the love kind of oozes out of the pages of the books. Like they're so really desperate to be together, and they've decided, and it's just so lovely to read. And then obviously there's different kinds of love. We explore mothers and daughters and mothers and sons and friends as well, and all kinds of different. And I think the reason why I love the fact that Stay With Me is also written in this time of huge political upheaval is because it reminds us that like human life and emotion and falling in love and getting married and all of these things, they still happen. No matter what's happening around us politically, historically, whatever, like our lives also move forward. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, I love love too. I think that love is in many ways what sustains in many of the forms that it shows up in. It's what nourishes, it's what sustains, it's the light, at the heart of, I think, both books. They would be, I think, impossible to read without just the sense of love and affection, for, say, for instance, this kind of good things as complicated as this families are. There's a lot of love, there's a lot of love. Some of it is without understanding, of the objects of the affection, but it's still love, and I quite like exploring that and thinking through all the ways that um, we nourish and sustain each other, as humans.
So what do you really hope to achieve through your writing?
That's a good question. Not one that I'm sure that I can fully answer. What do I hope to achieve? It's many things, One of the grand, I think, projects that I have in the way that I write is to write these characters and place them at the center, of their lives and of the reader's attention. Um, I don't want to write them in a way that they are marginal in their own stories, And that's what I hope that I achieve every time. That these characters in the world they live in and the community that they're from, for the period that the reader rather, is thinking about them and reading about them. Those people, their world, their perspective, their experience, their community, is centralized and universalized, in a particular kind of way. And I hope that I can achieve that.
Well, I certainly think you are achieving that. Your characters have stayed with me after I put the books down, and yeah, like I feel like you provide. It's going to sound really funny, but you provide a fully immersive reading experience. So it's such a strange phrase, but you do like it, absolutely brilliant. And actually, just on characters, like how do they form for you? Like, is it just something like, do characters come fully formed, or do you have an idea, or do you base them on people? How does it tend to work for you?
I've not had any one of them come fully formed yet. Some come more well formed than others, and some had the more difficult to write, I have to sit with them sometimes for a couple of years before I really understand what they're about and enough to write from their perspective. But many times for me, it's really that I have, a vague idea, of a person, and then I begin to write about them. And sometimes, there's a time I used to sit in the room and imagine that the character was sitting opposite me, and I'll ask them questions about their lives. And, I think that for me, the key that's at the heart of it is for me to know way more about them than we'll ever get on the page. So I have notes and questions about what was their first memory, things like that I think give you the sense that you're reading about a real person, like a fully formed human being. I think that's how I work with characters. But sometimes I have a vague idea, and then I just stay with it and keep thinking about this person. And sometimes when I'm thinking about a character, for like a week, I'm trying to see the world the way they would see it. Like I walk into a room and I think, oh, what would this person notice and why? Yes.
Yeah.
That makes any sense.
And I think it does, mate. It makes a lot of sense. And I think sometimes, I'll pick up a book and it will be either kind of very like plot driven, and I love the plot, but I will feel like maybe I didn't get to fully grasp the characters. And sometimes I'll pick up a book and it'll be very character heavy, and there won't be much of a plot, or the plot will be kind of a little bit rushed, or might have like a very neat ending or whatever. But I do feel like with your books, you really strike the balance. Like you give us really in-depth, fully formed characters that are complex and messy and full of emotion, but you also give us an incredible plot. Like that I don't always see what's coming. So like in this book in this span of good things I didn't see that ending coming. So that's always a good sign. There's always a good sign, I think. Keep me guessing. Because I was sure I had it figured out, and I was like, okay, I think I also know how it's gonna end, but it didn't end that way. So that was very good. But
thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking to you, and I can't wait for more people to read A Spell of Good Things and to revisit or discover Stay With Me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samia. It was really, really lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much to Bámi for an incredible conversation. I loved every second of it, and hope you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.